Thankfully, I'm alone this episode. The personification of mediocrity that is my co-host was kind enough to heed my advice to go have a heart attack and die. Sadly, he couldn't even do that right and will pull through relatively unscathed. He'll be back soon for another one of our joint reviews, arguments, debates, those things, what have you. Those are planned every other week. For now, I get to push forward, and it's liberating tossing off the dead weight that is Mr. Black for a small project of my own to fill the void in the meantime. With the sheer volume of content that we're wanting to cover, no doubt there will be side projects from the both of us. Mr. Black has some terrible ideas of his own, maybe, I assume. I wouldn't recommend anything that he writes up, though. It's awful stuff. Just focus on me for the time being. And with that, welcome to Viewing Solo. No doubt many of you listening will think I'm wrong and off base, and don't worry, I feel that way about almost everything I do or say. By all means, tell me how I'm wrong this time. With enough responses, I will attempt to put together a follow-up. And hell, I want to fine-tune my broader considerations around these reviews. So today's choice probably wasn't the best first choice, but being the masochist that I am, I invite the pain. Also, there will be spoilers. Lots and lots of spoilers, so if you're sensitive to things like that, just turn away now. I won't warn you again, and I'll only judge you a little for switching me off. It's fine. Just go. Just go. Now, assuming you're all gone, Man of Steel. It's caused me plenty of grief in the past. If Mr. Black were here, his bleeding heart would... Oh, wait. Shit, I didn't even mean to say that. But yes, I don't take it back. Mr. Black's bleeding heart would defend this film with all its might. He seems to love defending generally terrible things. However, I have a history with this film, and as this was my second attempt of getting through it, I finally managed to sit through the entire thing. It's a far bigger deal than it sounds, but with the DC Extended Universe powering along, and me getting my ass into gear setting up this podcast, I felt compelled to succumb to the peer pressure of various forums and the Twitterverse, and to give this movie a second chance, particularly with so many reassessing it as being a good film, particularly in the wake of Batman v Superman and Suicide Squad. We shall see whether or not that's the case. I tried to go through it with a blank slate, not taking into account future films or any fallout that Warner Brothers and DC have addressed with future titles. But anyway, let me start from a place of positivity. The grittier, subdued, desaturated color scheme was an interesting choice, one that I accept as generally good. It effectively serves a number of key factors that are important to incorporate into a franchise based on superheroes. It's a clear identifier, for better or worse, of the series as a whole. When you establish a brand such as the DCEU, it's important to make it recognizable, and for better or worse, the steely blues, the shades of grey, the off-white browns, and the faded reds or greens can be quickly and accurately linked to both the director and the franchise itself. They separate themselves from their direct competitor without sacrificing brand recognition, and thirdly, audiences separate this film from its physical source material. Something with its own distinct style, coloring, aesthetic, and reputation. It's a separation that, for the most part, allows the illusion of Man of Steel occurring in some possible reality. It also allows for liberties to be taken with all of the characters and the environments, because such a visual disconnect from the graphic novels has taken place. Now, where the theme falters is how liberally and consistently it's applied across the entirety of the film. Sure, it can be argued that it serves as a tumultuous and foreboding backdrop where Henry Cavill's embodiment of hope can contrast against it, but it is also valid to say that if there had been layers of diversity that allowed the background and environment to be an indicator of emotions, timelines, or turmoils coursing through Clark, then agitations for its use would have been far greatly subdued. A brighter motif for youth, innocence, or joy, the standardized darker pastel palette for contemplation, conflict, turmoil, and then the brighter blues and whites for peace and solitude. Instead, there was a subtle change in the brightness of shots in these moments to indicate these kinds of changes, but little in terms of color. As a side note, not related to my interpretation of Man of Steel at all, but to the wider DCEU, while having a consistent color scheme and graphic design motif is intelligent and it is best practice for branding, when you are attempting to weave a team of vastly different characters together, it breaks any sort of sense of reality to have them miraculously color coordinate to this extent. I mean, relatively speaking, they can't all have costumes that are on point. Despite this, the costume design in Man of Steel, in isolation from the other titles in the franchise, they look amazing, as do the iconography for Krypton, Wayne Enterprises, the Daily Planet, and all the other Easter eggs. And this is the same sentiment I have for almost every other DC Warner Brothers movie. As standalone titles, they all look amazing. Now, it's probably important to note here that I'm not a fan of spectacle for the sake of spectacle. Mindless action isn't in my wheelhouse, and there needs to be an investment in the emotion, or there need to be some sort of higher stakes that will result in devastating consequences before I even bat an eyelid to any action-packed situation at hand. Now, just because I'm not big on action doesn't mean I can't recognize compelling choreography and camera work. The fights between Superman and the two Kryptonian soldiers made me take note, for the first few minutes at least. Once they began padding out the confrontation beyond what was necessary, the novelty quickly wore off. But at least initially, the placing of a steady-cam perspective behind major moments of contact carried that sort of godly extraterrestrial weight of the physicality well. And I'm a fan of Snyder in general, his ability to frame shots, his capacity to make any moment picturesque and poster-worthy, all filled to the brim with Easter eggs and details, and hence why I share a common sentiment from many that he ought to be maybe a lead of photography as opposed to a director. Now I'm getting to the harder part of the film, which is the story. Now, sadly, little things could have been done to save this story, but they weren't, for reasons unknown to me except for time constraints. And let's start by saying there were good moments, and for the most part the dialogue was less cringy than one would have expected. Character interactions were smooth, generally realistic, and above all, I was happy with the way that Man of Steel handled humor. Now, some might ask, what humor? To which I'd reply, the subtle kind. By delivering something straight-faced, many may have overlooked it. I mean, sure, there wasn't a laugh track to prompt a reaction, but the writers give these deliveries a chance to stand on their own accord. They allow everything from the context of the line to the characters, backstories, to even external references to source material to play a part in the joke, or the quip, or just the solitary line. Most skillfully of all, it leaves no one out of the humor. It merely gives the few who identify the initial layers some additional appreciation for that particular line. Now, sure, they're not quips, it's not carefully crafted banter, and it certainly isn't ha-ha funny, but it is clever, and it does differentiate this franchise from others. And the U-turn that DC and Warner Brothers made mid-Suicide Squad production and now for Justice League disappoints me deeply, but that's another analysis for another time. The film also receives additional points from me for so blatantly objectifying Henry Cavill. I mean, the guy and his acting are both chiseled from Venetian marble by Michelangelo himself, so why not give everyone a little topless action? Women succumb to it constantly, and as a man, I have no qualms with saying, Cavill, you can take one for the team. So props to DC and Warner Brothers for doing that. As for specific plot points and dialogue moments in this film that were good, I have a brief breakdown. General Zod being programmed to defend his planet, forcing him to coordinate a failed coup against tactless leaders, and then tracking down Kal-El for the Codex was a compelling plot. It was one that actually made me more sympathetic to Zod than either Jor or Kal-El. Here was a man that was willing to risk everything to get shit done. Who would have succeeded had he not made the mistake of micromanaging a single deserter? A deserter, by the way, whose selfish desire for a natural-born child led him to steal a codex and potentially killing thousands of fairly far-along babies. The film never makes it clear what would have become of those developing children without said codex. And then he goes ahead and breaches the planet's seeming no privately owned rocket launch policy. In summary, Zod is a far better person than Jor-El is. Furthermore, initially skipping Clark Kent's landing and childhood development was a masterstroke from the creators. We can look at the development of this individual as a man in a far deeper and more meaningful way, and never mind. We get plenty of flashbacks and unconscious dream sequences to fill the blanks and pretty much have an origin story. Again, brushing past Lewis and Clark's first interaction was also a relief. But then subsequent scenes quickly pooped all over that decision, as did the rapidly developing relationship, which I see no capacity for have actually formed genuinely during the events of the film. On the other hand, having Lewis be the commanding, powerful journalist that she is was fantastic to see on screen. Now, the most compelling moments for me, were the tiny pieces of dialogue from both Superman's fathers. When Jor-El states that Clark will be a god to the individuals of Earth, it was a fascinating little droplet of foreshadowing, with all of the connotations and tension that arises from discussions of deities and beliefs hanging off those words. Such incredible potential there. And then the second, from Clark's terrestrial father, Jonathan Kent. And the simple, down-to-earth list of reasons as to why Clark should remain low-key. These were the strongest themes in the entire story that were never referred to again. And then finally, the ramifications and implications of Jonathan Kent's death were some of the best pieces of establishing writing that I have seen in the genre so far. What I mean by that is that the respect with which Kent handles his son's situation, and the vision of both Clark and John trying to figure out their situation together, and to simply make the most of what they have, it builds the stakes of the relationship to such a high point that it was abundantly clear what the loss of John meant. More so than Bruce Wayne's loss, more so than Tony Stark's loss, a real top-notch piece of establishing a character. Now, if only the loss had been handled in a far more elegant, logical, rational, cohesive way, maybe the entire sequence would have shone. But no, sadly, like every other good part of this film, it's quickly pissed and spat on by whatever follows. And, I mean, that's it for the good of this film, most with caveats. And that probably doesn't bode well for Man of Steel. One final defense of Mr. Cavill and his rendition of Superman is that those saying he doesn't smile, he does. What the writers didn't do was take up several opportunities for him to have smiled more, most of which would have vastly improved the scenes in which the smile was present. The bar altercation with the drunk truck driver, the initial crash into the mountain attempting to fly, taking a moment to smile and pat himself on the back for saving people. No, instead, they went for a brooding character which would have been fine if they hadn't messed up one crucial aspect of the film: the story. Putting to one side the writer's establishment of rules before quickly throwing them away, I will briefly address some of the lazy writing. Ex Machina is abundant here. From the opening sequences on Krypton, where Jor-El's pet catches him mid-fall twice, to Jor-El literally stepping out of the machine to assist his son. I mean, that is some desperate story progression if I've ever seen it. And furthermore, there is a reliance on forcing the audience to fill plot holes for themselves because the writers were too lazy to rearrange the actions in a logical manner to let them speak for themselves. For example, how can the Kryptonians fight so well on Earth? I thought they said they would take them years to develop that sort of strength. I don't know. Maybe it's the battle combat uniforms or something. Yeah, that'll do. It's the combat armor. Yeah, sure, whatever. Why did Lois get chosen to step onto the alien ship with Superman? I don't know, maybe because she was the only woman on the site at the time, maybe because she was the only one without a uniform, who knows? How did Jor-El know to help Lois on the ship? Oh, maybe because she was the only terrestrial on board. Maybe it was because she had hair. It doesn't matter. The most likely case is that it was rushed and not well thought out, because then you have far deeper problems in the writing, a heavy reliance on serendipity and coincidence, poor time management in the story, and horrendous throwaway lines that the filmmakers want you to believe is an unquestionable explanation for events, past and present, but in truth, they just raise more questions than they answer. Think about Clark happening upon a job that allows him to access the ship from his origins. Now, none of his previous work depicted in the film would suggest that his intention was to narrow down this search. He didn't have any experience that would justify him being savvy to an opportunity like this, nor would he, I believe, have the security clearance or the authority to be anywhere near a site such as this. And it could have been tailored in such a way that these logical steps were taken, but it wasn't. What about Lois being invited on top of the ship in the first place? I mean, sure, Superman has a sidekick he can pass on the codex to help him escape. How fortuitous, but why her? Why anyone at all? Necessity, apparently, to the story progressing. That's why. John Kent decides to save the family dog in the middle of a tornado, an act that if Clark had done instead, no one would have thought that he was a man of miracles, but it needed to be done, so we had Clark hiding for the first half of the film in mourning. Probably the most harrowing of all of these is that no government agency picks up on Kal-El's escape pod landing in Kansas. According to this universe, that happened shortly after the Cold War, and I mean, surely agencies are monitoring the skies out of fear that there'll be a flare-up of nuclear tension. I mean, clearly in our world, international war hasn't fallen asleep at the table, but according to this writing team, it did. And a metallurgist didn't report the discovery of an extraterrestrial compound. You know they give out Nobel Prizes for lowlier discoveries than a completely foreign, never-before-identified set of elements in an alien compound. But no, for the sake of the story, John throws a line away that no one noticed. This form of story execution makes it worse, not better. Had logic taken hold in that scenario, the movie wouldn't have happened. And there are a lot more that I wanted to mention, but these were probably the worst examples in amongst a sea of weak-ass story points. It would have been far more advantageous to have left all of those aspects a mystery, because then at least the audience has the opportunity to start from a blank slate, to reinterpret the story, but instead you provide the loosest of nettings to try to explain these things, and like I said before, all of these additional questions come out of those seemingly airtight explanations. And all of this is not mentioning that Clark is happier after the death of thousands of people than he is after the death of his terrestrial father. Also the fact that rather than the normal human response of fear seeing an alien in amongst the rubble, they call the man a hero without witnessing 90% of the battle. They say that because they want the audience to think that, much in the same way that Clark Kent, as a character, never thinks for himself once in this film. Everything he does, every belief he has, every decision he makes, with the exception of saving a few people, was handed down to him from a different person. His father tells him to be cautious of revealing his identity and his true state, and Clark listens. His other father tells him to push the bounds of his strength, and Clark listens. And only then does he do that. Clark never did anything like that after puberty ended and he discovered a subset of his abilities. Also, all of a day after finding out that he's an alien, he is sanctimonious about it and establishes an entire set of preconditions for how the government should work with him, and we never see that develop. And then finally, a priest, funnily enough, another father, told him to take a leap of faith to save humanity. And what happens? Clark listens. Clark Kent explores nothing on his own. According to the story, after his father died, he spent the next 10 to 15 years moping and completing odd jobs. And let me wrap up my analysis with something I briefly mentioned earlier, and that's this terrible trait of screenwriters, where they tie their hands together with rules for the plot and the environment that they set for themselves. And here, there are a couple of these rules for Superman, that he can't be near the atmospheric generators, and that the Kryptonians take years to adjust to Earth's yellow sun. They're good rules. You're setting expectations. You're giving this overpowered superhero some much-needed restrictions, but you need to see them through to the end. You can't just overcome those rules you lay down with something horrible like willpower and just yelling really loudly and jumping really hard, which, let's face it, is all Superman did when he was caught beneath the beam of the Kryptonian ships. Or have Zod take full control of the Kryptonian powers in the space of a few hours. You give up the integrity of the entire story for the sake of a nice action sequence. You also give up the internal logic of Zod's terraforming of Earth in that moment because suddenly he realizes he's just as powerful as the man he's facing down. Why not give every individual that he's set out to defend and reestablish that same opportunity of being that overpowered? Again, it's never addressed because rules are broken as quickly as they are established. And the destruction of the city, by the way, wasn't a big gripe of mine. I know it was for a number of other people. This idea that Superman should have saved all of these people is actually really well explained by CinemaWins. They posit the idea that this was his first fight, and he's a child in this way. He's inexperienced, and he's inevitably going to break something. And that is fine, more power to him for that. But the reactions to the carnage were what bothered me the most. Clark is happier a short time after the disaster than he was the 15 years prior pining for his father. The people instantly identify him as a hero as well. If the people in this film were to reflect reality in the way that Snyder proclaims, then Clark Kent would be shunned as just another violent alien looking to destroy the world, possibly a terrorist. He would be feared by everyone who hadn't witnessed him killing Zod and saving those individuals, and the media would be much quicker to paint him as a villain. Because, well, let's face it, hatred sells more clicks. The 2016 US elections ought to be clear proof of that. Ultimately, Clark Kent's behavior throughout the film is backwards. He should have begun in a state of joy and sunlight, working in Metropolis, understanding who he is and his place in the world. Then, discovering the space shuttle, he realizes his world has been turned upside down, and he struggles to become something as clear and coherent as what he believed himself to be before that discovery. And then, like a child, he faces down Zod, has a victory, and then is forced to realize what he's done to the city that he loves. And from there going into hiding. A point of positivity, however, having him kill Zod in that moment was the correct move. A number of people have postulated the possibility of him using one of his other abilities to have prevented him and kept him alive, but he was afraid. He was painted into a corner, and it was the first thing to spring to mind. But it was too little and too late in the state of this film for that to redeem everything we'd seen up until then. Now, Superman is a wonderfully complicated character to write. Overpowered with limited weaknesses, he is the perfect allegory for the United States itself in a number of ways, but sadly, no one is willing to utilize this figure to bring about deeper questions, ideas of identity, internal struggles, the potential for corruption of such unwieldy power, the pursuit of justice and idealism in the face of a disgusting world, and instead, an audience is given this. A protagonist that is spoon-fed everything he believes in, that is fully fledged with no imperfections or wiggle room to develop as a person on his own, a good little American immigrant that literally kills every last ounce of his heritage to be accepted as a citizen of the US. Maybe Man of Steel is an appropriate mirror for the world we live in today. If you're anything like me or identify with what I've said up until now, just don't see this film. Avoid seeing this film if you can. If you're forced to discuss it for whatever reason, then have it on in the background while you iron or vacuum or complete any homely duty, I assume inebriated in some way. Die-hard Superman fans and general DC fans will have seen this already, as will anyone who really loves mindless action with heavy-handed messages diluted down into single lines and an astonishing amount of sanctimonious Christian imagery. But all in general, to me, it's a bad film. And I'll be uploading a 10-second summary of it onto YouTube, and that should be more than enough to get you through what is a 2.5-hour padded mess.